everyone to come forward so we feel like we are more connected with you in the audience? Thank you. It's a big room. My name is Heather Grady, and I'm a vice president at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome. Xin chào. Da jia hao. Ahlan wa sahlan. I am so delighted to be back in Asia, where I lived in several different countries for many years. My last trip here was in December 2019. I did some workshops and teaching in China, and I didn't know how much the world would change just a few months later. So it's a real pleasure to be back. And I want to welcome our in-person guests and any of you who are on live stream. This session, as you know, is called Unlocking Philanthropy's Potential by Enhancing the Enabling Environment in the Global South. And this session is sponsored by the wonderful Global Philanthropy Network, WINGS, and we thank them. In this session, we're exploring how to enable change from within the Global South, expanding South-South communication and collaboration, ensuring there's a platform for the voices least represented, and investing more in those who are best placed to determine where resources and funding can be best deployed. Helping us to explore this are three very well-informed speakers. Andy Annett, who is with the Unreasonable Group, Regional Manager for Asia Pacific. Romy Chahyadi, the CEO and co-founder of Instellar, a social purpose business. And Claire Woodcraft, CEO of the International Venture Philanthropy Center and a fellow of the Center for Strategic Philanthropy at the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. So welcome to our three speakers. Listening to our speakers this morning and hearing about the sessions over the last couple of days, there's no question that we all have the intent to make a difference. But the question really is, how do we move from intent to actually making the biggest difference that we can with our effort and with our financial capital? So that's what we're going to talk about. So my first question today is to Claire. Oh, and let me just remind everyone, if you have questions, please put them into the app. We have two monitors up here, and we'll be looking at the questions. You can put them in at any time during the session, and we'll be opening up for questions in about 45 minutes for questions from the audience. So Claire, you worked with many collaborators around the world, I think primarily from the Global South, on a study that you issued from your center. So in that study, apparently you came out with two overarching, let's say a diagnosis of some of the major issues that are preventing a different kind of power dynamic between North and South and how that plays out. Can you tell us briefly about both the conclusions from the study and the methodology?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Heather, and thanks to the AVPN and to WINGS for having us here today. It's really wonderful to be reunited in person, of course, after all of these virtual events that we've been going to for the last couple of years. Although I do want to give a shout out to the Minister of Tourism from yesterday for the planting trees thing. I'm a little uncomfortable about flying long haul for the first time in 3 years and seeing how much great work is happening around climate change here. So I really hope that we can follow his great advice. As you said, Heather, I'm here in my capacity as a newly joined CEO of IVPC, delighted to be here. And also I am a WINGS board member, a proud one of that. And I will be, but of course, pulling from the earlier work, since I've just recently joined IVPC, actually just a week ago, pulling from the work we did at Cambridge, where I'm still a fellow, where it's exactly that, Heather. We looked at, so the research we did was purely focused on emerging markets or global south. Therein, I believe we have a challenge. I'm also slightly uncomfortable about referring to half of the global population as the Global South. So recently we had a discussion at I'm on the editorial board for Alliance magazine. I know they're here somewhere today. And we all had a discussion, so people from all over the world saying we're really not comfortable with this kind of Global South term, but because it's not sufficiently nuanced, but that's what we have, so let's roll with that. So we did a piece of research looking specifically within the Global South at Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And it was really kind of, it was just as COVID was, breaking out, and it was kind of a manifesto and assessment of, so what are the challenges in philanthropy in the Global South? What are some of the core challenges? And I'll come to the recommendations later on, but I think what we really wanted to highlight was, why is the Global South distinct from other markets? And thus, why is philanthropy different? Because I think if you look more broadly around the principles behind philanthropy, of course, we all want to create system change at scale. We want to maximize our impact. We want to deploy philanthropic capital as efficiently as possible. We know that we want to work collaboratively. And I think, wherever you are in the world, as a practitioner, your goals and your attentions are broadly the same. Equally, if you're looking at a particular sectoral intervention, be it education or health or climate change, again, you're broadly targeting similar goals. So what is it that distinguishes, what are the challenges in Global South philanthropy that are perhaps more pronounced? So we looked at two particular areas. So the first one is, of course, institutional voids. And of course, we didn't invent this term. It's been around certainly in academic practice for decades now. What distinguishes emerging markets is these institutional voids. And it's something that came up time and time again in our research. So we went to market and we interviewed over 40 practitioners from the Global South. As I said, kind of 30%, 30-30, 30 in the Arab world, 30 in Africa, and 30 in Southeast Asia, 30%. And they were consistently, notwithstanding their insistence that their markets were unique and distinct, but they were consistently highlighting challenges that related to those institutional voids. So these are things like, and we heard some of this, yesterday, and we've certainly in our meetings in the last couple of days been hearing, things like capital market maturation. So there is a significant difference in capital market in maturation in less industrialized countries, which means the continuum of capital is less connected, where you have perhaps angel investors, you have VC, but they're not necessarily systematically connecting with their philanthropic counterparts and the impact investors. Whereas in mature markets, I know from my time working at Shell Foundation, way back in the early noughties, that was already happening, where we were seeing listed companies, financial institutions already connecting with philanthropic practitioners, not even just impact investors. So I think there's the capital market challenge. There's issues around the judicial systems, legal systems, if they're not mature enough, some of the challenges around governance that, again, we've been hearing in the last couple of days from people, ensuring that boards are able to work effectively and support organizations when you're in markets where you have perhaps less mature governance structures. And of course, political systems, without going into detail, but I think that's a fairly obvious one, where you've got perhaps in some of these markets less clear understanding of the role of philanthropy and how philanthropic capital can actually create value at scale. And then the other big elephant in the room, which was actually kind of the core focus of our research, was of course the power imbalance. So I think that is something that we've seen really come to the fore with COVID, and there is really a global movement now looking at things like decolonization and indeed a whole movement around shifting the power. But I think what's really important about that is understanding what we mean by shifting the power. And what we've been hearing, again, from the market, that it's kind of really about two things. So the first thing is, when you look at global best practice in philanthropy, it has historically been dictated by organizations in the global north, irrespective, all extremely well-intentioned, but perhaps not understanding some of the institutional void challenges of the global south. So where we see often complex systems of disbursement of grant financing, for example, these are coming from institutionally mature countries where they have the capacity to manage perhaps a complex disbursement process, overlooking that in many parts of the global south there is still a capacity challenges across markets where systems and processes that are built in the global north are simply not fit for purpose for the global south. So that's, I think, one of the really important elements of this, clearly slightly polemic discussion around decolonization and shifting the power. But we need to recognize that where the systems and processes were engendered, when institutional philanthropy first started, they weren't created in these markets, and that creates a real challenge. And the second important thing, I think, is this piece of listening to where the capital is going. So are we actually listening to practices happening in these markets? We've heard yesterday about some of the, and last night, some of the amazing innovation that is coming from Asian markets. This is no longer, and we were just talking this morning about how we need more case studies about what works in philanthropy, and the case studies we have are in the main coming from the West and not coming from the global South. So I think that's why it's also really important that we start to capture the experience and share through knowledge garnering and better distribution across our community. And I think AVPN, this event, is actually a wonderful opportunity for doing so. Let me stop there, Heather, and I'm happy to share later on some of the recommendations for how we indeed enhance the enabling environment.
Thank you, Claire. I think that's a great jumping off point for our discussion. Romy, in 2013, I think, you received a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to establish the first social enterprise incubator in Indonesia, and later you secured funding from others. This was an important stage in the social enterprise development within Indonesia. But thinking about the incredible innovations that take place and the fact that I would argue that philanthropy and philanthropic practices and efforts are certainly more dynamic in Asia than they are certainly in the United States and Europe, but maybe anywhere. What are your reflections on what's happened? So that's about 9 years ago. What's happened in the last decade? What do things look like in Indonesia? And Claire posited some challenges. Is that what you're seeing?
Yes, I related a lot to what Claire was just sharing, actually, Heather. And looking back 9 or 10 years ago, I think we have seen a lot of great development. I think not only in Indonesia, but in the region, actually, Southeast Asia, Asia in general. Yes, we did receive a grant from Rockefeller at that time, to 2013. And at that time, of course, you can imagine that if the term social entrepreneurship was really new, actually, even here in Indonesia. And so the grant was used to run the first cohort of incubation for, I remember, 8 social enterprises. There are a few reflections about this. The first one is that philanthropic effort does take some time to bear meaningful fruits. That would be my first reflection. We secured another funding from another foundation to continue our work. And now, 10 years later, we have supported more than 250 social enterprises. So we were quite lucky, and we are very grateful that at that time, for example, in dealing with Rockefeller Foundation, we were not asked, for example, to produce, can you incubate 200 social enterprises, for example. 8, I mean, 8 is a small number, right? But you have to start from 8, or 5, or 10. But to really see the changes, the outcomes, the development in the ecosystem, we have to wait, because it's, I think, kind of a ripple in the ocean. We will have to build until a big snowball would come, actually. So that would be the first point, Heather. The second point is for the implementing organization on the ground. This is, for example, in our case, and this is related to what you just shared, Claire. We have to be very entrepreneurial from the start. And even though at that time the organization receiving the grant was a non-profit, in our mind, we already thought, okay, this will not last long, only 1 year. And so even though we are using a non-profit model as a legal entity, but our mind is very curious to see whether we should move to another model. And this is where I am now. At Instellar, we are using actually a for-profit model now. I can share with you a story, for example. there is some, I think this is a very good point to discuss, like you mentioned about the institutional barrier. When we receive grants from, let's say, Rockefeller or other foundations, of course there are some requirements in terms of how we use the grant, how we are accountable to use the grant, and so on. There is one instance which I like to share maybe. I think it's a good time to share this now. We were engaging with a big NGO at the time in Indonesia, and everything was fine. We agreed on the program and the budget, and then I asked this question to this big NGO because we were about to partner with them. As an organization, whether we are for-profit or non-profit, we need to secure some surplus from the budget because we want to continue our operation. This is not just one-off thing for us. So this organization, our potential partner said, yeah, you can include it in the overhead section of the budget. I told them, yes, we could do that, but you would see like the overhead would be like 50% of the budget if we include the surplus that we want to keep. And the deal was off actually, because we could not, they did give an option actually. An option they give is, so we were considered as a partner for this NGO, and apparently as a partner we have to basically disclose the budget, which is fine, we are totally fine with that. But basically we cannot keep the surplus apart from the overhead. I found later that actually there's another option which is a vendor status. So if they consider us as a vendor, we can just invoice them basically. We would say this is the deliverables, this is the service that we provide, and they will just pay the money. We do not have to disclose the budget. And so it's actually a very clean way of doing things. But there is a barrier from their side. They have the probably a bit of prejudice, I think, that if they are working with a vendor, the vendor would be less committed rather than if they are working with a partner. This is new thing for me. This was new thing for me because in the previous work which I've done, I did not make this kind of distinction. So this is, I think, something that we can discuss, Heather, between the implementing organizations and the philanthropic organizations making donation or grants. I think both sides needs to make changes and break the barriers, these institutional barriers. I will stop there, I think. Yeah.
So you're saying this big NGO, which was acting as a funder and probably getting their capital from other foundations or funders, they thought if they gave you a grant, you would be more committed than if you are operating as a vendor and they give you a contract.
Yes, correct.
So this is as I think all of us are familiar with what happens when philanthropy, which we've heard this morning, and we always hear this at conferences, philanthropy can take more risks, philanthropy can be more flexible. I think what we often find is it's a sector that's particularly rigid in its practices. And this is again rooted in not just in the laws of the country that's where the money originates, but just in practices that become very common in an institution, and then it becomes the status quo and it can't be changed. So I think that's a great example of where you were asking for flexibility and you found rigidity.
I think to be very clear, I do not blame the NGO at all. I understand that they have to operate within this structure, within this system. We were having conversations with the program director of this big NGO, so it's at the top level already. But I think, so we need to find ways how we can work over this.
Yes, thank you. Andy, so you hail from the UK originally, but you've spent a lot of your career working in Asia, Myanmar, Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and elsewhere. In these very different contexts, you've drawn some lessons about how to create sustainable businesses and a more enabling environment to invest in. Share with us some of what are your big takeaways after your years of working in this area?
Thank you, Heather, and hi, everybody. I've got sort of three areas that I think are good perspectives in terms of what we're talking about. The first one is my day job at the moment, which is with the Unreasonable Group, where we have a portfolio of private sector businesses, over 90 businesses right across the region, where we are providing support and expertise and funding connections and working with various impact businesses around there. And I think what I see there is the impact, the venture philanthropy coming in as part of the mix mixed up with corporates, with venture capital, strategic finance, and so on. And I think as a broad sort of takeaway from that, I think people do look at venture philanthropy and impact investing and the sort of blurred lines between there. But I think people look at it that as, all these ventures look at that as just another form of financing. It's not something that it sways them one way or the other. You know, they'll kind of take money where they get. And, you know, the lines and the difference in sort of structures between venture philanthropy and venture capital is actually very similar now, in terms of the impact measurements reporting and the structures and the valuations and the detail and the support that they give. So actually what I'm seeing is not a huge amount of structural difference between receiving investment from a venture philanthropy or an impact investor or traditional VC. So I think that's one area on that side of things, and that works whether it's a global philanthropy player or a regional one or a country by country one as well. They're all sort of the same, and some very good examples do that. The second thing is, prior to this job, I was working for a thing called the Spring Accelerator, which was a mix of developmental finance and philanthropic finance. So this was an organization working across 9 countries across sub-Saharan Africa and South and Southeast Asia, which was an entity supported by, essentially led by what was then DFID, it was now FCDO, the British Development Organization, USAID and DFAT in Australia, and the Nike Foundation. So the 4 of those parties got together and produced a multi-year program focusing on businesses impacting girls across the region and using human-centered designs and initiatives around that. So that was very much sort of catalytic capital, if you like. This was a 5-year program working across these countries. And to say that what we saw there is that the link between certainly what the Nike Foundation wanted out of this and the development organizations, the global development organizations that wanted out of this were very aligned, very, very similar. They worked very well as a sort of 4-way consortium doing that. And then the role of really philanthropy came at the next stage. So essentially what they were doing was creating these businesses, developing these opportunities, and then also providing essentially alumni services to help those businesses take off, and a lot of those were taking off using philanthropic capital. So at that stage we were looking at philanthropic capital largely coming from regional or indeed local organizations. And I think in that sense and I'm talking the countries that you mentioned, Heather, that I'm talking about here, which is Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh. A lot of the local philanthropic organizations were much less sophisticated than the regional ones. I think what we see is that anything on the regional side, you know, the caliber of the organizations that we have at this conference, you know, there is no difference between the caliber of the philanthropic techniques and the caliber of what we're doing in Asia, in the global south, than anywhere else in the world. So I don't see that as a difference, but I think once you get very local, then it becomes slightly more challenging in terms of imagination and the ways they do it. And they become almost more conservative the more local they get as well, and less sort of sophisticated on that side of things. And I think the third area, say I've lived in Myanmar for many years and seen multitude of changes in that country. And what I've seen there is a lot of catalytic philanthropic capital coming in, particularly in the work around sort of accelerators and small and medium-sized enterprises and things taking off. So some of you may have been in a session yesterday with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, who are currently doing some great gender work in terms of supporting enterprises and female entrepreneurs through their accelerator support. And that is a pure, philanthropic, it's a very good example of some very much pure philanthropic capital coming in to really create an ecosystem around that. There's been similar ones with organizations like the Amidia, various philanthropic groups and Luminate and things around catalyzing digital skills and expertise around Myanmar as well, through organizing accelerators and just a whole ecosystem around the opportunities around digital. So I've seen some very, very good examples there of philanthropic working very, very, very successfully. But again, that's another example in Myanmar of where the very local traditional philanthropy is traditional, I would say. It's not unsophisticated, it's just traditional. So it's faith-based, it's donation-based, it's sometimes sort of politically based in terms of what they're doing. But the opportunities there that I see are very much with the next generation. So you see this next generation of families, next generation of sort of the next generation down of families, bringing completely different views and things through. So I think that's what I'm seeing a lot of hope there, and almost without exception, the older generations are the traditional way of philanthropy, and the new generations are bringing in all the techniques and the innovations that we've been talking about over these few days of the conference.
Thanks, Andy. That's, by the way, I think a change we're seeing in countries around the world, that as wealth is inherited from an older generation, generally a patriarch of a family, and it's going to the widows and the children, we're seeing some really interesting changes in what people are funding and how they're funding. I really want to celebrate on this panel funders who we think are doing a great job. We were supposed to have Shivani Garg Patel from the Skoll Foundation. Unfortunately, at the last minute, she could not make it. That's reality in the times that we're in. She was going to talk about how Skoll funds enabling ecosystems locally and regionally around the world. And I think, Andy, you've mentioned some examples. You mentioned Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Omidyar and Luminate. Let's get some more from any of you three. Who do we want to celebrate, who are not just funding one big winner that's going to scale their own impact and growth, but actually funding an ecosystem that supports movement toward impact?
Yeah, maybe I can pick up on that one, Heather, and pick up on some of the points that Andy and Romy were making, and actually coming back to some of our key findings in our research, which absolutely resonated with what both of you were saying. One of the three final recommendations, the first one was work with governments, and I think we are seeing, talking of foundations convening along the continuum in the ecosystem, we've seen some amazing examples of innovation in Southeast Asia, of where COVID actually accelerated or deepened, as my friends at Tanoto Foundation said to me yesterday, these relationships with governments. So I started by talking about institutional voids. One of the challenges we have in some of these markets is governments have often been reluctant to work with philanthropy and often over-regulate, not quite understanding its potential. What COVID did was created amazing opportunities to demonstrate to governments that actually philanthropists are partners, and they can bring innovation, they can fund the risk, buy down the risk, and then work with governments to scale. So Tanoto Foundation is a great example of an organization that works very closely with government and enabled scale scaling through that partnership. And they absolutely saw that relationship deepen during COVID. YTL is another one, YTL in Malaysia, that had been working on digital education for a long time, and then COVID came along, and suddenly governments are going, well, what is this digital education thing? How do we fast track that? And we also saw that in Brazil and in other markets, where foundations in a way came to the rescue, and governments kind of had an epiphany around, oh, actually you're not a threat to us, or some kind of form of, you know, pseudo-insurgents, who are actually viable partners that have products and services that we can help you scale. So I think that piece about working with governments is really important. And yesterday we heard 2 ministers call out AVPN and endorse AVPN, and I think that's brilliant, because one might not have seen that, you know, 10, 20 years ago, governments really embracing the sector. So that's important. The second recommendation that we made was, to Romi's point, let's just unrestrict this funding. Let's just really commit to flexible, both flexible capital where it can go, but also, you mentioned, Romi, there was, you know, that these INGOs are saying, look, we've got to work with the structure. Why? Why do we have to work with these structures if they're not working anymore? So let's collapse some of the structures. Let's really ask the question, just because we've always done it this way. So that relates to things like, you know, I still hear people saying, yeah, but we don't want to unrestrict all of our giving. Why not? If unrestricted works better, empowers, encourage new different ways of generating enterprise and social enterprise, then why not do it? So I think there needs to be a radical change. We've been talking about unrestricted funding for decades, and I think COVID really highlighted just how important it is. And quite frankly, there's no excuse. The Center for Disaster Philanthropy in the US did a report during COVID that said if you removed McKinsey Scott's unrestricted portfolio, only 5% of capital that went out during the crisis was unrestricted. That is crazy. How can you empower local communities and drive the innovation that we're talking about if you are still dictating, calling the shots, challenging whether you actually, you know, you can have a surplus or not? So, and that leads into the final point around our core recommendation, which won't surprise you, even though we made this recommendation before I was working for IVPC, variously referred to as a sister to AVPN, EVPA, Latimpacto, and AVPA in Africa, a sister organization, mothership, and even yesterday I heard the word godfather. But anyway, IVPC, thanks to our founder Doug Miller, has essentially been supporting these networks, seed funding these networks. So our third recommendation, as I say, before I joined IVPC, was fund networks. Networks are powerful amplifiers of voice, of best practice. They relate to bringing this capital along the continuum, connecting the dots. We know that no longer are you going to have single foundations investing. The ministers both said it yesterday, you know, we cannot work alone. Well, how do you not work alone? Through networks. I've been a CEO of a foundation. It was only once we got engaged with networks, which was actually AVPN and EVPA, that we started to meet our peers and find different sources of funding. And that was, you know, a good 10 years ago. Now that we're saying, let's look at blended capital, how are you going to find those various actors if we don't fund networks? But the challenge is, global funders often are averse to funding networks because you're creating an institutional value, and that ain't easy. It ain't easy to articulate. It's not easy to measure. It's not easy to say, hey, is this thing we did? But it's so important. I mean, we're seeing in these days, you know, ahead of the power of bringing this community together. And I think when you're running an individual foundation, you get very caught up in the day-to-day operational stuff. And it's actually then when you want to connect with partners, that's why we see this dearth of collaboration. It's not easy. So I think that is such an important thing that we don't lose sight of. It's not just about having a conference like this, which is amazing, but it's about institutionalizing these relationships so that as we get more sophisticated in our capital deployment, we are making sure that all of those actors on the system, on the ecosystem, are brought together for what? For more impact. And sorry, the final point, because your question was about next gen. I think it's absolutely brilliant that you see next gen philanthropists coming in. Their starting point is innovation and enterprise, and kind of the last thing I want is, you know, a standalone institution that works just with itself. And I think that is, of course, the big disruptor, especially in Asia. And we see that. I mean, the work we did with Tanoto Foundation clearly demonstrated that the next generation is bringing intrinsically that kind of entrepreneurial, innovative thinking without anybody needing to ask them to.
Before we move on to other questions, I do want to say, Romy, do you want to call out any other funders that are doing a great job?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think even before AVPN was created by Doug there. I would mention, for example, DBS Bank out of Singapore, and they have done some activities even before they created the foundation. Now they have DBS Foundation. And I think they have been doing this very consistently. You can see it in their strategic business plan for the region. They are in the 6 markets, if I'm not mistaken, in Asia. In Indonesia, very consistently they are doing this. If we look at a bit broader outside Southeast Asia, I would mention, for example, Hyundai, the car manufacturing company from Korea. They have been supporting the social enterprise movement in Korea, and in the last 3 years, they've been doing it in Indonesia, actually. So there are just a few, actually, Heather, but I also want to note what Claire just mentioned. So I brought with myself this week for AVPN conference 3 of my colleagues, so there are 4 of us, and I told them, look, there will be more conferences after COVID. Now it's a bit okay, but if we were only allowed to go to just one conference, go to AVPN. I have to be honest that most, 80%, 90%, if not all of the contacts that we build, the networks that we build, were from AVPN, honestly. So yeah, so I totally agree. I think network should be funded, and it's really hard, I think, to get funding for network, because as you mentioned, the value is hard to measure, it's hard to be articulated. So, but all of the major clients that we have now were from these conferences. I will stop there, yeah.
Thank you. We wanted to highlight in this panel South-South collaboration and supporting voices and perspectives and individuals and organizations that don't always get the representation or support that they need. And I was struck this morning, I really congratulate Rob Rosen from the Gates Foundation on the first panel, admitting a failure. So can we combine this question? And Andy, I wonder if we start with you. Can you think of, well, what would you like to highlight in terms of this? And also, can you think of any failures, particularly when it comes to collaboration locally or across a region?
Firstly, I'll just go back to what we heard from the Gates Foundation this morning. And I think this sort of link between boldness and risk, you know, that we hear about. And I think that, you know, what Rob was also wrote down when he was talking about resilience, curiosity, and optimism. So I think that, I mean, absolutely we should be bold, but it doesn't mean that, I mean, risk, you know, it doesn't mean you, by being bold, it doesn't mean you have necessarily have a larger chance of failure, if you like. And I'm not sure, you know, that these things should be seen as failing. You know, it's just we took a bold risk, and if, you know, sort of nothing ventured, nothing gained on that side of things. So I think it's about being brave, and I think it is, you know, something that you can do, but it's not doing. You know, there is always logic and rationale and substance behind these decisions. So it's just it's having a little bit of permission to be brave on that side of things. I mean, I think just going back to the example I was talking about, Spring, in terms of working across, you know, working across in markets like Nepal, where you have some very difficult, systematic investment and follow-up sort of structural challenges. And I think the investments and the philanthropy from the Nike Foundation, things went into that. Ultimately, and I'd say similar with Myanmar, actually, if you look at those, probably, well, for Myanmar for slightly different reasons, but 3 out of those 5 businesses don't exist anymore. But the flames that were lit by doing this impacted not just tens and hundreds of employees across those companies, but that the environment that created for those hundreds of employees who have now dissipated as well. So we've gone on that. So whilst those entities don't necessarily survive, what you've done is you've lit the flames under literally hundreds of experienced now entrepreneurs, employees, people who have the vision, have had the experience that they will take, and as they dissipate across the countries, they will take those things and then do their own versions of that, do their own little things, seek out of that side of things. So whilst those businesses, some of those businesses no longer exist, the impact of those on the recipients, but particularly on the employees, has been great role models for, and the life will live on, if you like, after that.
Thanks. I have some more questions from our panelists, but I see there's a question that's popped up, so I'm going to turn to that first. And I just want to remind you, if you do want to pose a question, we would love some more. If you go on the app and look at this session, there's a section that says questions, and you can just type it in there, and it will come up on our monitor. So this one is posed to Claire and me, but I'm going to invite all of our speakers to answer it. How are foundations preparing for a possible coming global recession? Will grant-making decline, or are funders committed to continuing to give to some of the urgent causes we're discussing here, like climate change and health, in spite of an economic downturn? And I would add, we heard about other crises this morning. I think it cannot be underestimated, the crisis in education in almost every country in the world. Not only did children in many countries lose 2 years of schooling, but they lost what they had learned in the year or two before that, because you can't retain that necessarily. So a crisis in education. Food security was mentioned this morning. We have a coming crisis in food. So Claire, I'll ask you first, what do you see?
Yeah, just very quickly on that, because again, it actually relates to the research that I don't think this started just from fear around recession. I think that this recognition that we need to be more self-sustaining around finance was certainly happening during COVID. It was actually Naina of AVPN, amongst others, who said to us during our research back in 2020, 2021, we get that the days of securing large amounts of capital from the global north are waning, and that there needs to be much more resilient on local markets. And actually, she mentioned it also in her opening speech yesterday, the fact that Asia, of course, is a source of something like 40% of this upcoming intergenerational wealth transfer. We certainly saw that in other markets in Africa during COVID, that they simply weren't getting funding from traditional funders who were turning domestically to fund their own local crisis with COVID, who were saying, it's gonna be about peer funding, peer networks, peer sharing of data, so how can we collectively go out and raise capital? So I think that trend has started a couple of years back, where people are looking for capital from local markets. And that means working across the continuum. It means in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, and in Latin America, talking to the private sector, saying where you were, again, we've seen that historically using CSR for some marketing-related program, talk to us about creating some kind of blended approach where we're using multiple sources of capital. So I think, even before the predictions of a global recession, our sector has become much more proactive in looking for alternative sources of funding and indeed, of course, revenue streams, and not just simply being grant dependent.
Thank you. I'm going to give a quick answer and then ask Romy and Andy to weigh in. But in the United States, most of you will probably know this. There's a specific law for foundations, not for LLCs, not for donor-advised funds, but for foundations. By law, have to spend 5% of their endowment every year on charitable purpose. Now, this can be averaged over a few years. But one of the really interesting phenomenon that I've witnessed over the last 3 years, at the beginning of COVID, foundations were so worried that their endowment was going to shrink, so they shrunk their spending, and they turned down more grantees, and they put grantees on hold. Then the markets for investors did spectacularly well in 2021, and suddenly, some foundation endowments literally doubled or increased by 50 to 75%. then it was very easy to get money. Now, a lot of funders are sitting again and waiting to see what's going to happen. What's interesting to me about this is it's very reactive, it's very destabilizing for both domestic and international grantees, and I think that the sector in the United States hasn't really dealt with that sufficiently. Then, of course, you have funders in other countries, whether we're talking about China or the Netherlands or elsewhere, where there's not any policy or law about how much has to be given away, but when markets are unsteady, a lot of them just say, let's just sit on the money. There's a saying, dry powder. We want to keep more dry powder, which of course is not very good for impact. But that's an interesting phenomenon that I think we should talk about more. And I wonder if more South-South giving can break that pattern of funders looking at their own bank that they're sitting on and thinking more about giving it away, irrespective of what's happening in the economy or in financial markets. Romy, what are you seeing here in Indonesia?
I'll take this from a slightly different angle. I think the core theme here is resilience, actually. If you look at your response just now, is resilience from the funding side, from the funder side, their ability to keep giving grants. But actually, on the recipient side, this is totally realized. So we've been working with quite many non-profits in Indonesia who realize that they no longer can depend on grants. They want to diversify their source of revenue, basically. And this is, I think, at least in the case of Indonesia, I can safely say hundreds of non-profits are feeling the same, working towards the same goal, which is how they can diversify their source of income, their source of revenue, so that they no longer depend only on grants. And this is not an easy task, honestly, because for decades our brothers and sisters in this sector, they're not accustomed to think about a business proposition, value proposition, creating product and services. So in our work now, actually, we are working with some of these non-profits, helping them to see, okay, what kind of assets they have. Assets here, not only fixed asset, but also knowledge, networks, experiences, which they can turn into product and services for specific customers. Then once it's identified, we can set up some pilot to test it, very much like an ideation process in a business sense. But for those, our friends who are in this sector, in the non-profit sector, this is totally new. This is a new thing, new way of thinking. It's very different. They would ask questions like, for example, can we keep our missions while we are doing business, for example? Can we keep our values when we are doing business? So I think these questions, Heather, is really about resilience. And I think not only on the funder's part, but also on the recipient part. And I think this is felt by everybody. I think both sides have to work on this. So I think that would be healthier for us moving forward.
Thank you. Andy, I want you to answer this, and then I want you to segue into the next question here, which was, Andy said venture philanthropy, impact investing, and venture capital are increasingly structured similarly. But is that a good thing? Because their expectations in terms of returns can be quite different.
Right, I shall try and segue into that one as well. No problem. Just very simply on the previous question about the recession and what happens, I think Heather, you're exactly right in that there will be pressure on endowments, and that will be just directly related to that. I think the other side of that coin is that, and you're beginning to see this in countries already, is that there's increased need. You know, things like food security, things are going to be very, very serious, they're going to be very bad. So you've got this sort of perfect storm of less endowments plus more need for the more traditional things. So I think there's some problems there. And I think the area that will be lost temporarily is about is around innovation. You know, I think things will retrench back into the core sort of, you know, core themes, core giving needs, some more essentially basic philanthropy. And I think the areas around the innovations, the more the more risk side of things will be the areas that's going to be lost through the recession. So I'd be worried about that. Just going back to that question about the, I did talk before about the sort of venture philanthropy and impact investing and venture capital sort of being together. I'm looking at this, and this is very much from an entrepreneur or for a recipient's perspective. And when they're getting money, if they're getting $3 million, one from a venture philanthropy, one from an impact investing, one from venture capital, essentially that money is the same. The structures are the same. One person will be the lead. It could be any of those three groups that are taking the lead. But essentially, from an entrepreneur or someone who's activating this capital, money is money to a certain extent, and the rigor that is happening in venture philanthropy and impact investing is the same as venture capital. And going back to a point that we made earlier, I see much worse behavior in venture capital and much more unreliable investing from just in terms of just the behaviors of what happens between an investor and a giver and a recipient from the venture capital side than I do from venture philanthropy and impact investing. So I think they're certainly seen as better things to have, but commercially, a dollar is a dollar, a rupee is a rupee, and so on. So that's what I mean. I was looking at it very much from a recipient's point of view, that I see there's actually a closing gap in terms of the requirements and the rigor that's going on, and the difference between the impact requirements from an impact investor or venture philanthropy things are closing and are very similar in many cases. And I think I'd just also like to echo on this point as well, the absolute value of unrestricted funds, the restricted funds as well. I mean, it relates to this as well. But when you've got unrestricted venture funds, these are really fantastic, and that's where the innovation can happen. That's where the risk can happen. But with restrictions comes lack of risk, I would say, as well.
Claire, do you want to answer this as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, actually, to Andy's point. I think some of the challenge around venture philanthropy is when people associate it with venture capital, they think, well, venture capital is all about a certain level of failure. You have to fail before you suddenly succeed, and then you get huge returns. So is that what we want in the philanthropic sector, all this massive failure? But I think, the common thread is this idea around innovation and testing new ideas and incubating and then scaling up things that work and not scaling up stuff that doesn't. Because frankly, in our sector, quite often we're quite bad at keeping stuff that we sort of really know doesn't work that well, but it's, we've always had it. And I've seen, and mea culpa, run programs where it's sort of, you intrinsically realize it's not creating system change at scale, but you keep it going. So I think, what we should take from the industry of venture capital, notwithstanding the very different nature of trying to secure very significant commercial returns versus us trying to secure system change at scale. But what we should take from it is that, you can embrace failure, to the point that you mentioned earlier, Heather, and that we were discussing this morning. When I was at Child Foundation, which was one of the early pioneers of venture philanthropy, before it was even called venture philanthropy, we actually called it enterprise-based philanthropy. And after 5 or 6 years of our old school traditional model, we wrote a report saying we failed. With our old school model, 80% of what we did failed. We failed to create impact at scale. So we had a real internal, deconstruction of our model, and we built a new model, which then subsequently led to 80% of grants creating impact at scale. So I think, what we need to learn from venture capital is that, there is that opportunity to innovate and to be entrepreneurial, and that failure is a good thing, again, to cite ad nauseum institution, if there is institutional learning from it. Clearly, we're not going to champion failure, but if we can collectively learn from each other, that can amplify impacts, right? And we are, as we all know, again, we've all said ad nauseum, we're very good at at not sharing failures and at reinventing the wheel. And what we're trying to do at IDPC is really counter that and say, look, there are some amazing examples of high-impact philanthropy in Asia and in Africa and in Latin America. How can we ensure that those communities are sharing and fast-tracking the learning instead of each region having to go it alone? And that's really, you know, why we were born with that idea of linking these philanthropic practitioner communities, so we can fast-track the learning and that we can, you know, be confident in saying, yes, we had a programmatic intervention which didn't go to scale. Here's the reasons why, and therefore, henceforth, we'll be doing things differently.
Can I just add to that, Claire? There's another point, I think, between these two gaps, and I say, if you, certainly people that I was speaking to in my one-on-one meetings yesterday, and I would challenge you all to do this, I think what we're seeing, certainly within the environment of AVPN over this conference, is a huge amount of backgrounds, you know, people working in venture philanthropy from capital market backgrounds, and you know, venture philanthropists then moving into impact. So I think the skill sets, the professionalism, the disciplines, the perspectives are being sort of much more amalgamated, I think, for good, you know, across these three areas as well. I think there's a lot of, you know, just individual personal movements between these sectors now, which I see as a very positive thing.
Thanks. I can't resist adding a little fact. I have it on pretty good authority that the phrase venture philanthropy was first used by someone leading the Rockefeller Foundation back in the 1950s, I think. And I'll give two examples, and the first one everyone will like, the second one you may or may not. The first example is investments in supporting the public health infrastructure of countries around the world, including the United States, Canada, Thailand, and many, many other countries. And the point was, the idea there of venture philanthropy was, we will use our philanthropic capital to work with governments and with nonprofit entities and with changing public awareness, working with academia, investing over literally decades to strengthen a system. That was the idea of venture philanthropy. And it was experiment, and some will fail, but experiment, invest for the long term. Another example, which is more controversial, is the Green Revolution. In Latin America, in Asia, and in other parts of the world, investing over the long term, working again with governments, with academia, with the nonprofit sector. This was, I think, the original spirit of venture philanthropy, and I think carries on today, although it's morphed. It is, you know, it's a dynamic. I think a lot of the words that we've been using on this panel, whether it's social enterprise or impact investing or whatever it may be, these words can mean different things to different people. But the point is, when it becomes a meme or when it becomes a phrase that we use together, we can converse and adapt and develop a sector. Yeah. Another question has come up. Let's see which panelist wants to answer this. What potential opportunities and challenges are there for new areas like the care economy, which require the involvement of philanthropy, government, employers, entrepreneurs, and investors? Who would like to talk about that?
Happy to give it a first shot. I mean, I think this is something that we're all seeing now, right? This, you know, convergence of capital, different actors in the ecosystem. But the challenges are, of course, that these entities are not used to working together. So I talked about one of our recommendations in our research at Cambridge was work with governments. Now, why historically has that not happened? Well, in many emerging markets, governments, as I said, have been historically suspicious of philanthropic capital because it came from civil society. And if you are in a country where, you know, government is not, or fears the growth of civil society as potentially opposition to government, there are some examples of horrific regulation. You know, I can give you examples of in the Middle East where trying to set up any kind of philanthropic entity will take you years, involve 4 different government entities, and they will insist that they see everything from your strategy to your communications plan before they approve signing off on your registration, and then insist on who's on your board. So, you know, governments historically have made it quite difficult to bring this philanthropic capital to market. Now, I think that's changing with the needs of the COVID crisis and now the needs of, you know, potential global recession. And what we need to be doing is working together to learn about the best way to regulate our sector. And it actually relates to the point you just mentioned, Heather, which we've again been talking about the last few days. We have such complex terminology and vocabulary that we use in our sector, everything from catalytic capital, strategic philanthropy, enterprise-based philanthropy, venture philanthropy. You know, as a community, we struggle to articulate to each other which bit we're talking about, and then we're surprised when external entities get confused. And you know, when I came through, you know, last night at the immigration, the guy said, "What business do you work in?" And I said, "Philanthropy." And he said, "What's that?" And I was like, how much time do you have? Because there's kind of a long queue behind me. So I think, you know, that's something as well IVPC I think we'll be looking at is how can we standardize this terminology and simplify it so we bring other actors into this space. So governments in all of the markets that I've been working in, Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, are looking to better deploy philanthropic capital, but they are, you know, equally perhaps not aware, don't understand. You know, why would you expect any government official, often overseen by different ministries? So in some markets it's the Ministry of Interior, some it's the Ministry of Economy, some markets it's the Ministry of what it could even be, you know, innovation or development assistance. So I think we as a community need to help actors that are not directly in our sector understand the value of philanthropic capital. And we also need to help them regulate it, which may sound like a difficult challenge, but I mean, I've worked as a head of public affairs for a corporation historically. Governments are willing to listen to outside actors when it comes to regulatory systems, if you've got something to say, and be influenced by that. So I think we should be much more closely working with governments to help them understand what we're trying to achieve and how regulation can be developed to facilitate, indeed, the title of our session, enhance the enabling environment.
Yeah, I can add something on that. In the context of Indonesia, for example, there has been some emerging trends in the past 2, 3, 5 years even. For example, in terms of investment, we used to really distinguish between impact investors and conventional VCs, for example. But nowadays, both impact investors and conventional VCs, they are both looking for business with impact and business for impact. So there is some convergence there. Another actor, for example, is government, to continue from Claire. Yeah, 2 ministers were here yesterday for the opening, and Pak Sandiaga, he was and probably he still is an entrepreneur. He understands about impact investing. In Indonesian government, I think there are at least 4 ministries, 4 different ministries at director levels who understand and aware and supportive of social entrepreneurship, impact investment. However, yes, we do need to be patient, honestly, to keep working with them, because it does take time for them to create, for example, regulations or programs which are conducive for the ecosystem. But what I'm trying to say is these different stakeholders are moving together into one direction, at least in Indonesia. So I'm quite optimistic about this, that moving forward, more and more players, at least in this country, will be more in the same wave in terms of, okay, how do we move? Also, there are many family foundations in Indonesia. They are also here, some of them, Tanoto Foundation and the like. So yes, we don't have maybe precise vocabulary, languages, but at least in the movement, these are the people that on the same level, in the same wavelength, I would say. So I'm quite optimistic about that.
So let me ask a question that this prompts for me about the care economy. For each of you, how you measure the results of your work, how do you describe when you're reaching success? And I'm curious about, this could be either for your organization or what you've heard about. Are there differences in terms of getting funding from a government in Asia yeah, let's talk about Asia. So funding from a government in Asia or an intergovernmental organization, or a funder in Asia, a philanthropic funder, a funder from the United States or Europe, or a government from the United States or Europe, or in other words, I also don't like this term global north and global south, but I'm wondering, what are the differences that you see? Are there nuances in the way that you describe and report on your impact depending on who's giving you the funding? How are the expectations different? Yeah.
Sure. So yes, there are differences. So for example, some of our corporate partners, usually they are quite intentional. In the first discussion, they would say, okay, these are our targets. This is, for example, some of these initiatives that we are doing in Indonesia, it's part of marketing communication, for example, exercise. And this is quite clear from the beginning, so it's fine, it's marketing communication. Another partner, corporate partner, would say, no, we set up a separate entity. For example, I would mention IKEA, for example. We are working with IKEA now. They set up IKEA Social Entrepreneurship as a separate entity. It's not IKEA the business, it's not IKEA Foundation even. So it's IKEA Social Entrepreneurship. And IKEA Social Enterprise can give grants, they can also invest directly in the social enterprises. So distinct expectation, different from other partners, corporate partners who are doing, we are doing this, we are supporting social enterprises, impact businesses, but this is a marketing communication exercises. You're asking about funders from abroad. We did work with, I think, a few development agencies. Mostly with development agencies are administrative requirement, I would say. So not so much into the actual intention. So internally, when we deal with different set of expectation, of course we have to deal differently, but internally we set our own impact model. So we agree internally, okay, so now we are, in Stellar now it's a for-profit model. We are a company, limited liability company. So internally we would set up our own impact model, our theory of change, because we are dealing with this different set of expectation. What do we really want to do to achieve this year? And it's not easy, honestly. I think any organization would face this. Output is easier to measure, of course. Outcome is next, and impact, I don't know, maybe until we die, we would never know what impact we create, right? But we agree internally, Heather. So in our case, for example, our main expectation or hope is to help impact entrepreneurs to be more sustainable and scalable. In one sentence, that's it. If they are in the early stage, then we help them to have their working business model slightly next to the stage. If they are also already sustainable, then maybe if they can be scalable, that means getting investment, for example. And at different stages of the journey of these enterprises, we would work with different corporate partners, different international development agencies. We are now having a program actually working with investors because they are looking specifically to invest in specific sectors, industry of businesses which create impact. So that's how we deal with it.
Andy, you want to go next?
Yeah, I can't hand on heart talk about the care economy. It's not something that is a particular specialization, but I just think more generally about the mix of, you know, philanthropy, government, employers, entrepreneurs, and investors. I think it's difficult to generalize. I think there are, you know, I've just recently worked with some, you know, big international philanthropic investors who have, or international philanthropic organizations who have virtually, they just give the money away. I mean, you know, they've got virtually no discipline. Equally, I've worked with some very small ones who are very rigorous. Government, we heard yesterday from the minister, who was an ex-private equity billionaire or whatever he was. You know, so again, I think right across all these sectors, you know, you've got good entrepreneurs, you've got very conservative entrepreneurs, you've got very, very inspirational entrepreneurs. So I think it's less generalizations between North and South. And I think, you know, in every country that I've worked in, you've seen some brilliant examples of innovators in every sector, be it government, be it entrepreneurial or anything else. And I think it's about finding consortiums of attitudinally aligned people, and I would say there's always, there's always someone, there's always a bit of an organization that has that sort of, the attitudinal sort of work that goes with it. So, and I say that attitude could be, very bold, and that attitude could be very rigorous. It doesn't need to be the same thing, but just to find within these organizations just specific alignment attitudinally, I would say.
Claire, what about you? Any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, just on, well, going back, so not specifically to the care economy question, but your point around measuring impact and how that differs. So if I think back to my time, I mean, my whole career has been in emerging markets, and only actually 2 years at Cambridge in the UK. And I think things have changed a lot. So back in the day, 10 or 20 years ago, I started my career working in more traditional development with NGOs and receiving donor funds. I think there's been a massive shift from the sort of dictatorial, we will tell you how you will measure your impact. And here is the massively complex reporting process that you need to follow in order for you to get any more funding. And I remember working for a very small NGO in Palestine in the late 1990s, and a tiny NGO, and actually refusing money from the European Union. So they gave us an initial tranche and we took it gladly. And then they said, well, if you want any more, here's the reporting standards you need to follow. And we were like, are you kidding? There's 3 of us in this organization. If we follow your reporting standards to demonstrate our impact, it will take us 3 months to complete the documentation. We will have, will undermine our very mission. So we actually refused the funding. I mean, that's how crazy it was back in the day. So I think things have improved a lot. Certainly when I worked at Shell Foundation, we were getting, of course, the rise of social entrepreneurs, where life becomes more interesting, because the social entrepreneurs will say, we have a business plan. So we as a foundation didn't say, hey, you need to give us a reporting module. They would say, this is our business plan. If we haven't achieved our targets, we'll let you know. And then we would have a discussion and say, great, okay, let's talk about why you haven't achieved the targets. Is it, and often it was, regulatory reform, a new piece of legislation, distribution of products to market, which was real value add in terms of building the intellectual capital around scaling up social enterprises. Now, today, what I'm seeing, and at Cambridge we have an executive education program specifically for emerging market philanthropy, and we have a module on impact measurement. And it doesn't talk about any specific tool or any specific methodology. It talks essentially, and God bless Cambridge, philosophy. How do you, well, I mean, it's kind of rooted in that, and I won't even dare to attempt to try and explain what my academic colleagues teach, but it really is about thinking more philosophically. So what are we trying to create here in terms of social value? And how are we going about that? What is it helpful to measure? Why are we measuring this? Why are we doing this? So it's a much deeper conversation. And then the conclusion is every individual entity or institution needs to have a role in defining how you measure impact that works effectively. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about, we need to collapse these historical structures around, assessing impact or success is some singular reporting mechanism. I mean, that is really a product that I think was, born in the global north around large institutional capacity. But it needs to be a conversation, needs to be a discussion, needs to be institutional learning. This is how we measure impact, not because there's one single tool. So when people on our course say, okay, how do we do it? How do we measure impact? I kind of start going, well, let me tell you, the way you do it is, and I'm like, come on, guys, there isn't a single methodology or tool. It's a philosophy. And it's about, understanding, particularly for large organizations that are giving funding, what the recipient organization is able to report on. What is useful for them? What data should they be capturing? And how can your reporting system enable the grantee, if you're a grant maker, rather than become a massively burdensome approach? And I think on that front, things are changing. They're changing rapidly, and COVID was a great catalyst for that. And I remember one of my colleagues in Africa who was on one of our webinars, he said, you know what, when we were, this is more about the grant-making process, he said, I had guys in crisis. We would tell them, give us a voice message, WhatsApp voice message. That was the application process. You need a grant? Go on WhatsApp, send me a voice message as to why you need it, and that's how we're going to disperse. So I think there's a huge amount of innovation happening now. The digital transformation of the way we do philanthropy is really helping. And so I don't think there is one way to measure impact or success anymore. I think it's a process, it's a collaboration, and maybe it is, a philosophy.
Thank you. I think I'll be a little provocative on this point because I think it's come up a lot at this conference, and I think all of us do believe in collaborating with governments. But whereas I think we're seeing a lot of innovation in measurement and reporting in philanthropy, we're seeing it less so in government. I know that grantees that I work with, well, here's a story from a wonderful organization that's a social enterprise in Myanmar. They trained their funders, their philanthropic funders, over a series of years to allow them to report one aligned report to all of their funders that really looked at outcomes and impact and not so much at individual outputs. And then they were graduated to being able to apply for funding. I think in that case it was the US government and the EU. And suddenly it was just like you said, the requirement for the grant was reporting suddenly on 56 output indicators on a quarterly basis for the funding that they were getting. And so the philanthropic funders thought of it as, this is success because now they're able to apply for, tens of millions of dollars in multi-year funding from public agencies. And in fact, they decided to either reject it or take it on an experimental basis. And you mentioned the European Union, that's rather legendary. And a lot of us now are working on environment and climate change. And that begs the question as well. The largest environment funder in the world is the Global Environment Facility. Does anyone here, raise your hand if you've ever applied for funding or if you have funding from the Global Environment Facility? Okay, I see just a couple of hands up. Unbelievable. The amount of reporting that's required. The proposal itself, about 160 pages, and then a lot of really detailed reporting. And their own evaluations come out with very positive evaluations of individual projects, and yet what's happening to our global environment is we're going backwards. We're really having problems. So that kind of reporting does not add up to aggregate impact. So I think this is going to be a real challenge, and maybe there's an opportunity for AVPN to work more across Asia on these questions of how we can converge some efforts so that we don't end up, working at cross purposes. We just have a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of the panelists to wind up on, first of all, any final thoughts on what we've been talking about, but also, we talked this morning, some of the speakers talked about listening. Are we really listening to each other? Are we really listening to communities and beneficiaries? What have you seen as best practices that you want to encourage there that we can learn from? So, Romy, you want to start?
Yes. I think we have to be brave to have difficult conversations. And I think this works both ways, from the funder side, from the recipient of the funding. I think we have to be brave to have difficult conversations, to be vulnerable even, to say that we cannot do this, or this is the alternative, and vice versa. I think this is not, I know that we voice a lot of probably inputs or criticism for the funders, but I think we need to have conversations constantly, because otherwise it will just like saying, you have to change, I don't have to do anything. I don't think that's the way to go. I think we both have to change, and that's including saying no to potential projects. That includes saying this is not going to work bravely. This includes also saying there is another option of doing this bravely, and to have open conversation about this. I think this is needed, and I think this would path the way to better innovations and better solutions to our situation.
Thank you. Claire?
Yeah, I mean, kind of really repeating what Romy's just said, but I think listening to people at this conference and just reflecting on my own work in the sector, forever we've been talking about, we work in silos, et cetera, and I think, I've run a foundation in the Middle East, and it was only when we started to get involved with networks that we really started to understand how to build our capacity. And I think that's what we need to be, institutionalizing networks, and that's really going to be our role at IVPC now as we kind of really activate this organization, is ensuring that there is South-South sharing of knowledge and learnings. And this issue or case studies keeps coming up. And when we started our course at Cambridge, everybody said, please don't give us, Western case study. You focus on the Global South and give us Global South case studies. Now, building case studies, building tangible knowledge products that you can share, that are accessible, that are relatable, takes time, it takes investment, and I think that's something that we really need to be doing more of. We can then use, certainly as IVP, we can use our networks, AVPN, EVPA, and the AVPA and Latin Pacto, and Wings, our friends at Wings, but this broader community, we need to be finding ways to capture the stuff that worked and the stuff that didn't, and work with governments also to help them understand. So these emerging market governments that are seeking to regulate philanthropy, let's engage with them around, if you want to facilitate, if you want to enhance the enabling environment in the Global South, you need to be aware of historically why were there problems, issues around reporting, and what enables philanthropic capital. It is this innovation, it is being more collaborative, being more understanding, being doing the due diligence, but in a way that is enabling and not restricting. So I think it's really that, building this community as a knowledge community, South-South, that not just expecting, best practice to be dictated by the global North, but and encouraging this next gen and this intergenerational wealth transfer to radically change the way we create social value at scale. And I think, events like this, where you hear incredible stories last night and this morning, just that it's happening, but we need to amplify it, and we can only do that by coming together as a community.
Andy.
Yeah, I agree with that. Just to finish off 2 points, I think ultimately my career was in marketing and branding and so on, and it was all about sort of human-centered design and thinking of your consumer and thinking about your customer. And I think, a couple of things that I've mentioned, but thinking about, if you're in the philanthropy space, think about what the recipient needs. Look at it from their perspective all the time. So, it reverts back to the point about, funding and impact and the reporting requirements and everything else, and what do they need? Think about what they need and how you can deliver that to them rather than what you want, and delivering it downwards, if you like. So I think there's a whole area about that which works across everything. And then I think I completely agree about the community and the network effect. If you like, that can work very much at a country level as well, in a sort of a local community level, as opposed to a big regional or global side of things. And it also works in verticals as well. So if you've got a thematic area around whatever it is, around the care economy or gender or something else, again, as a community, look at the vertical community as well as the sort of the broader countrywide or philanthropic community that you work, and at a very local level, networking it still seems to be a scary thing for lots of people, and it's the worst part of the job and all this sort of side of things, but it is extremely valuable, and certainly the work that we do on Unreasonable is all about peer-to-peer, the massive benefits of peer-to-peer learning, peer-to-peer networks, peer-to-peer sharing, and it really is invaluable.
Thank you. Well, we had a lot of rich perspectives come out in this panel. I hope everyone in person here and online has enjoyed it. I'm not going to attempt to synthesize anything. We were sometimes tough on ourselves or on other organizations. Let's remember, organizations, even when they're imperfect, are filled with, as we said this morning, superheroes who are trying to make a difference. So we have to continue to find each other and celebrate our successes, even as we learn from our failures. So thank you, all of you. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists today. Thank you, and let's continue to network, build networks as we go through the conference.